The first snowstorm of the year hit the south side of Chicago just after 7:10 p.m., covering the sidewalks in wet gray slush, while freezing rain tapped softly against storefront windows along West Archer Avenue. Neon signs flickered through the weather above closed barbershops and corner liquor stores, and somewhere farther down the block, a train screamed across rusted tracks hard enough to shake the loose glass inside nearby apartments. A delivery driver stood beside a broken-down Honda Civic, arguing into his phone, while steam drifted up from a sewer grate near the curb. 3 blocks away, a dark gray SUV rolled slowly toward an aging brick apartment building with a flickering security light above the entrance. Shaquille O'Neal sat behind the wheel wearing a faded black hoodie, old jeans, and white sneakers stained with road salt from melted snow. The digital clock on the dashboard read 7:18 p.m. He had already driven past the building twice without stopping. This time, he finally parked. Apartment 3C still had yellow curtains. That surprised him more than it should have. 16 years earlier, he used to tease a woman named Caroline Mercer about those curtains every winter. He always said they looked like something stolen from an old roadside motel outside Milwaukee. She used to throw kitchen towels at him, while laughing so hard she had to grab the counter to stay standing. Sometimes she threatened to replace them just to make him shut up. She never did. Some people leave your life slowly, but tiny details refuse to leave with them. Shaq stared up at the third-floor window while snow drifted across the windshield. Warm yellow light glowed faintly behind the curtains. A shadow moved once inside the apartment, then disappeared. His chest tightened immediately. 3 weeks earlier, Shaq had attended a private youth arts fundraiser downtown inside the Holston Cultural Center near Wabash Avenue. The day had already exhausted him before he even arrived. At 6:45 that morning, he filmed a sports segment in Atlanta. At 12:20 p.m., he signed licensing paperwork worth $8, $4 million inside a glass conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. By 5:06 p.m., he was eating cold chicken parmesan from a plastic takeout container, while traffic barely crawled along Interstate 90 beneath freezing rain. By the time he entered the gallery at 7:42 p.m., all he wanted was silence. Instead, he found a drawing. It hung near the back wall beneath a single amber spotlight. Charcoal on rough cream paper, nearly 4 feet wide. The drawing showed a giant man sitting alone at a city bus stop during winter, while snow piled heavily across his shoulders. One oversized hand held a tiny paper coffee cup, his head tilted downward slightly, not defeated exactly, just tired in a way money could never fix. The title card beside it read, "Waiting for Spring" by Ellie Mercer. Shaq stopped walking, because the man in the drawing was him. Not television Shaq, not celebrity Shaq, not the smiling version from commercials and podcasts, the lonely version. An older woman named Judith Bell eventually approached him carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She smelled faintly of peppermint and wore silver glasses low on her nose. Her eyes moved carefully between Shaq and the drawing before she quietly said, "She didn't use photographs." That sentence stayed inside his chest for days, and now, sitting outside apartment 3C at 7:21 p.m., while Chicago snow swept across the windshield, Shaq realized he still hadn't recovered from hearing it. He turned off the heater. The silence inside the SUV deepened immediately. Outside, ordinary life continued around him, shopping bags, rustling, sun sirens echoing somewhere downtown, a couple arguing near the pharmacy, snowplows grinding against wet pavement. Nobody on Archer Avenue cared that Shaquille O'Neal was sitting alone inside a parked SUV, trying to gather enough courage to knock on one apartment door. That mattered somehow. At 7:24 p.m., he finally stepped outside. Cold wind hit his face hard enough to sting. Snow settled across the shoulders of his hoodie, while his sneakers pressed into icy slush near the curb. The apartment building entrance stuck halfway, before finally opening with a loud metallic groan that echoed through the tiny lobby. The elevator was broken. A handwritten sign taped beside the doors read, "Out of surface again. Sorry." Management Shaq stared at it for 1 second before starting up the stairs. His footsteps echoed heavily through the narrow stairwell. Overhead lights buzzed softly while somebody upstairs played old jazz music through thin apartment walls. By the time he reached the 3rd floor, melted snow dripped slowly from his sleeves onto the concrete floor. Apartment 3C stood at the very end of the hallway. Warm yellow light glowed beneath the door. Shaq stopped walking. A soft piano melody drifted quietly from inside the apartment. Slow, careful, almost nervous. Then another sound appeared beneath the music. Laughter, young, female. Shaq's stomach tightened instantly. He knocked once. The piano stopped immediately, Silence filled the hallway so quickly it almost felt alive. Then came movement inside the apartment, hurried footsteps, a chair scraping softly, someone whispering too low to understand. The lock finally clicked at exactly 7:29 p.m. The door opened 4 inches. Caroline Mercer slowly appeared behind it. Time had changed her gently but honestly. Silver now touched parts of her dark, curly hair. Thin lines rested near the corners of her eyes. She wore a loose grey sweater with flour dusted near one sleeve, and the moment she saw him, her entire body froze. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Snow melted quietly from Shaq's hoodie onto the hallway floor between them. Then Caroline whispered softly, almost breathlessly, "Shaquille, not Shaq, his real name." And somehow that hurt more. Shaq looked at her carefully. I saw the drawing. The color drained slightly from her face. Then suddenly, somewhere deeper inside the apartment, something crashed hard against the hardwood floor. A sharp sound. Heavy. Accidental. Caroline immediately turned toward the hallway inside the apartment, panic flashing across her expression before she could hide it. Shaq saw it instantly, and standing there outside apartment 3C while snow drifted silently across Chicago at 7:30 p.m., he realized something before another word was spoken. Someone else was inside that apartment. Someone who had known exactly who he was for a very long time. Caroline still stood halfway behind the door, as if letting go of it completely might cause her entire life to collapse into the old apartment hallway. Warm yellow light spilled softly across her tired face, the kind of exhaustion that only comes from carrying too much alone for too many years. Somewhere inside the apartment, an old radiator clicked unevenly while snow continued sweeping past the windows outside. Shaq looked at her carefully before speaking. "Who's in there?" Caroline tightened her grip on the edge of the door immediately. "You shouldn't have come here." That wasn't an answer. Silence stretched between them. Downstairs, someone dragged a metal trash bin across concrete, the harsh scraping echoing up through the stairwell. The smell of chicken soup drifted faintly from another apartment nearby, making everything feel painfully ordinary. Because the moments that change your life forever rarely happen in special places. They happen in the middle of ordinary ones. Shaq lowered his voice. "Caroline, I just want to talk." She laughed softly. Not the kind of laugh that comes from happiness, the kind that comes from someone too tired to keep pretending they're okay. "It's been 16 years, Shaquille." He didn't answer. "You disappeared a lot easier than I thought you would." Caroline looked down at the hallway floor. "At first, I kept thinking maybe you'd call. Then I thought maybe you were just too busy. After a while, I started believing maybe you simply never wanted to come back." Every sentence landed quietly, but quiet things can still cut deep. Shaq swallowed slowly. "I never tried to disappear, but you still did." Inside the apartment, the hardwood floor creaked again. Someone was standing very close to the hallway inside. Shaq heard it. Caroline heard it too. She immediately glanced back over her shoulder before lowering her voice. "Please." He studied her for another few seconds before finally nodding once. "Okay?" Caroline hesitated for a long moment, then slowly opened the door wider. The apartment looked almost exactly the way he remembered it. Small, warm, old but carefully cared for. A brown couch sat against the wall beside a standing lamp with a slightly crooked shade. A narrow bookshelf near the window overflowed with old novels and picture frames turned face down, as if someone didn't want visitors seeing too much. The air still carried traces of cinnamon and coffee, and suddenly Shaq remembered winter mornings from years ago when Caroline would cook breakfast in thick wool socks while soft jazz music played low enough that only she could really hear it. Part of him softened instantly, then he noticed the shoes. A pair of black Converse sneakers rested near the hallway leading deeper into the apartment. Small size. One shoelace had been replaced with a dark red one. Flecks of white paint still clung to the rubber sides. Not Caroline's shoes. Shaq stared at them longer than necessary. Caroline noticed immediately. "Don't," she said quietly. He slowly lifted his eyes toward her. "How old is she?" The apartment went completely silent. Somewhere outside, an ambulance siren drifted through the snow before disappearing into the city. The radiator continued, tapping softly in the corner, while Caroline stood motionless, near the kitchen table, beneath the warm yellow light. "You don't get to ask that question." Her voice trembled slightly now. "Not after all these years?" Shaq didn't argue. He just looked back at the Converse again, because those shoes reminded him of the drawing in the gallery. And somehow, he already knew the answer before hearing it out loud. Then a young female voice suddenly came from the hallway. "Mom." Caroline closed her eyes immediately, then she slowly turned around. A young woman stood at the entrance to the hallway leading deeper into the apartment. 19, maybe 20 years old. Dark curly hair loosely tied back. An oversized grey sweater covered most of her hands, both stained with charcoal and paint. She held a sketchbook tightly against her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her steady. And her eyes, Shaq stopped breathing instantly, because he had spent years seeing those same eyes staring back at him every morning in the mirror. The girl studied him carefully too. Not like a fan, not nervous, not excited. It was the look of someone who had spent years imagining a person, only for that person to suddenly become real. The apartment fell completely silent. Finally, the girl spoke first. He looks older than he does in the drawings. A short laugh almost escaped Shaq before he could stop it. Caroline immediately covered her face with one hand, like she couldn't decide whether to cry or yell anymore. And standing there inside that tiny apartment on the south side of Chicago, while snow continued falling outside the windows, Shaq realized something before anyone else spoke another word. His life had just stepped through a door that could never be closed again. Nobody spoke for nearly 10 seconds after that sentence. The old clock hanging above the kitchen ticked slowly while snow continued tapping against the windows outside. A police cruiser rolled past Archer Avenue, red and blue lights briefly washing across the apartment walls before disappearing into the night. The young woman still stood at the end of the hallway, holding the sketchbook against her chest. Shaq couldn't stop looking at her. The longer he stared, the more familiar details began appearing. The eyes, the jawline, the slight hunch in her shoulders whenever she felt nervous, even the way her thumb kept rubbing the edge of the sketchbook when she was anxious. He used to do the exact same thing before playoff games. A strange feeling moved through his chest. Not shock exactly, not even pain. It felt more like someone had quietly placed an entirely different life in front of him. Caroline finally took a slow breath and spoke first. "Ellie, go back to your room." The girl didn't move. "Mom, please." Ellie tightened her grip on the sketchbook but kept staring at Shaq. "Does he know?" Caroline stayed silent, and silence answered everything. Shaq felt his heartbeat pounding hard enough to hurt. Slowly he stood up from the couch, the wooden frame groaning beneath his weight. Suddenly the apartment felt much smaller. "Ellie," he said softly, but Caroline cut him off immediately. "Don't say her name like you have the right to." That hit him harder than any insult he had heard on television or social media in the last 20 years, because she was right. Shaq nodded once. "I understand." "No, you don't." Caroline laughed bitterly. "Do you know what I had to say all those years? Do you know what it feels like watching your child grow up and having to pretend you're calm every time she asks about her father?" "Mom," Ellie whispered. "No." Caroline shook her head, eyes beginning to redden. "I'm tired." Wind howled harder outside the windows. A delivery truck rumbled past the building, making the apartment tremble slightly. In the kitchen, the kettle began softly boiling, but nobody moved toward it. For the first time since he arrived, Caroline looked directly at Shaq. 16 years ago, I called you 13 times in 3 weeks. Shaq froze completely. Every call went to voicemail. She smiled without humor. Then somebody finally called me back. Something in Shaq's expression changed instantly. "Who?" "Someone from your image management team." Caroline crossed her arms tightly like she was still cold. "He told me not to ruin your life. Said you were already dealing with bad press, sponsorship contracts, and lawyers." Shaq didn't speak, but his entire body had gone rigid. Caroline continued, her voice growing lower with every word. "He said if I really cared about the baby, I should stay away from your world." Ellie lowered her eyes to the floor. Shaq stood motionless, because he knew men like that, knew them too well. For years, people around him had treated human lives like PR risks to manage. They screened calls, blocked messages, controlled stories, decided who could get close and who needed to disappear. And sometimes they did it without him even knowing. A cold heaviness spread through his chest. "What was his name?" Shaq asked quietly. Caroline hesitated for a few seconds. "Martin Kessler." Shaq closed his eyes immediately. He remembered that name. Martin had worked crisis management for one of Shaq's old branding partners around 2009, a man in expensive grey suits who spoke about human beings like they were legal problems waiting to happen. "I didn't know about this," Shaq said softly, "but it still happened." That sentence dropped over the apartment like heavy snow. Ellie finally stepped farther into the room. The warm light hit her face more clearly now. She was taller than Caroline by several inches, nearly shoulder height to Shaq even at her age. Charcoal stains covered the sleeves of her sweater drawing before he arrived. Shaq looked at the sketchbook in her arms. The drawing in the gallery, he asked carefully. You made that? Ellie nodded. Why? She studied him for a long moment before answering. Because Mom always said you liked waiting for buses more than riding limousines. A quiet laugh escaped Shaq before he could stop it. A memory flashed through his mind instantly. Winter 2007, Caroline sitting beside him at a downtown bus stop around 11:48 p.m., drinking hot chocolate while asking why an NBA superstar preferred public transportation. His answer back then had been simple, because nobody cares who you are there. Ellie watched his face carefully. You really said that? Shaq nodded slowly, and for the first time since he walked into the apartment, something in Ellie's eyes softened. Not trust, not yet, but less distance. Then suddenly, Caroline's phone vibrated loudly across the kitchen counter. The name glowing on the screen made her face drain of color immediately. Shaq saw it clearly. Martin Kessler. The apartment suddenly felt colder than before. The phone kept vibrating against the small kitchen table, the sound almost insect-like inside the quiet apartment. Nobody moved. Martin Kessler still glowed across the screen beneath the dim yellow kitchen light, like the past had suddenly walked back into the room without knocking first. Outside the windows, the snowstorm grew heavier, slowly burying the parked cars along Archer Avenue, while the distant sound of a train echoed through the Chicago night. Caroline quickly grabbed the phone and turned the screen off. Too fast, too practiced. Shaq noticed immediately. People only react that way when fear has become routine. Ellie noticed too. She slowly lowered her sketchbook onto the dining table and looked at her mother with tired eyes far older than 20 years old. He's still calling? Caroline didn't answer. That was another answer. Shaq stood silently in the middle of the small living room, his broad shoulders nearly touching the kitchen doorway behind him. He had spent enough years around lawyers, PR managers, endorsement deals, and people who called themselves protectors of the brand to understand exactly what was happening here. And the thing that bothered him most was the fact that Caroline was still afraid. After all these years, the phone vibrated again. This time, Ellie reached for it before her mother could. She looked at the screen for a second, then let out a cold little laugh. This is unbelievable. Ellie, Caroline warned immediately. No, Mom, seriously. Ellie turned toward her. What else could he possibly want now? It's been 16 years. Caroline tightened both hands together. You don't understand. I understand enough to know you panic every time his name shows up. Silence fell over the apartment again. A snowplow scraped loudly outside, the harsh metal sound dragging across the street before fading into the distance. In the kitchen, steam from the kettle curled slowly toward the ceiling, softening the yellow light above them like an old memory. Finally, Shaq stepped closer to the table. He didn't touch the phone, didn't raise his voice, didn't ask another question. That surprised Caroline more than anger would have. I'll handle this, he said quietly. Caroline immediately shook her head. No, Shaq looked at her. I don't want lawyers. Her voice trembled now. I don't want the press. I don't want this turning into headlines with strangers showing up outside this apartment. Ellie crossed her arms near the kitchen doorway. Mom, you don't understand what the internet does to people. Caroline continued, speaking faster now because panic had started taking over. Once this gets out, Ellie's life will never be normal again. Shaq stayed quiet for several seconds. Then he slowly looked around the apartment, the old couch, the crowded bookshelf, utility bills clipped beneath magnets on the refrigerator, the smell of cinnamon still hanging in the air, a small peaceful life built carefully over many difficult years. He understood why she was scared. People think money can fix everything. Sometimes money just makes the world arrive faster. Shaq finally nodded slowly. Okay. Caroline looked genuinely stunned. I won't do anything until you're ready. Ellie studied him carefully, like she was trying to decide whether he actually meant it. Then Shaq turned toward her. But I need to know something. Ellie didn't speak. How long have you known who I am? She rubbed her thumb lightly against the edge of the sketchbook. Since I was 13. Shaq felt something sink heavily inside his chest. Caroline leaned back against the kitchen counter, exhausted. I didn't want to tell her, but eventually she started asking questions. Why she was growing so tall, why people at school kept staring at her, why she didn't really look like anyone else in the family. Ellie gave a dry little laugh. Google handled the rest. Shaq almost smiled, but he couldn't, because suddenly he realized how much he had missed. The questions, the birthdays, the awkward teenage years, the heartbreaks, the nights she probably needed someone, an entire life growing quietly without him. And he had never been there for any of it. The phone finally stopped vibrating. The silence afterward somehow felt even heavier. Slowly, Shaq reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a simple black business card. He placed it gently on the table near Ellie. No giant logo, no flashy title. Just his name, a private number, and an email address written in silver lettering. "That's my personal number," he said quietly. "No assistance, no company." Caroline stared at the card like it might change the entire room. Ellie just looked at him, for a long time. "Are you really coming back?" she finally asked softly. Such a small question, but it nearly knocked the air out of his lungs. Shaq didn't answer right away, because some promises sound like lies when spoken too quickly. Finally, he nodded once. "If you want me to." Ellie looked down at the card again before meeting his eyes. "I haven't decided yet," she admitted quietly. Shaq nodded. Fair enough. Outside the windows, snow continued burying Chicago beneath layers of white, while the streetlights blurred softly through the storm. Inside the small apartment on Archer Avenue, nobody was angry anymore. That somehow felt sadder. Shaq slowly pulled his hood back over his head and walked toward the front door. Caroline followed him into the hallway. She stood close enough to feel familiar, but far enough to remind him how much time had passed between them. "Shaquille?" He turned around. Caroline looked down at the floor for a few seconds before speaking quietly. "I really thought you chose to leave." Shaq stood still. Then very softly he answered, "Maybe I let someone else choose for me." Something painful moved across Caroline's face, and for the first time all night, she didn't look away from him. Shaq gave her a small nod before turning toward the stairwell. His footsteps echoed heavily down the old apartment hallway, while behind him, the door to apartment 3C remained slightly open, just enough for him to see Ellie standing there, still holding her sketchbook, still watching him leave, like she had been waiting for that moment her entire life. Snow had nearly buried Archer Avenue by the time Shaq stepped outside the apartment building at 8:12 p.m. Cold wind swept between the old brick buildings, hard enough to shake the loose fabric of his black hoodie. A city bus stopped near the corner, its doors opening with a burst of warm air before closing again behind a handful of exhausted passengers. But Shaq didn't get on. He stood near the curb for almost 3 full minutes, just staring up at the window of apartment 3C. The yellow light was still on. A shadow moved briefly behind the curtains, then disappeared again. Slowly, Shaq pulled his phone from his pocket. The first person he called wasn't a lawyer, wasn't an assistant. It was Marcus Reed, a man who had worked beside him for nearly 17 years, handling operations for one of Shaq's investment groups before retiring quietly in Indianapolis. Marcus had a reputation for remembering everything: emails, receipts, schedules, internal conversations. The kind of man who archived his life because he trusted memory less than evidence. If anyone knew what Martin Kessler had done, it would be Marcus. The call connected after the second ring. "Shaq, I need help." Marcus immediately went quiet for a second. Then his voice lowered. "What happened?" Shaq watched snow swirl across the streetlights. "You remember Martin Kessler?" The silence on the other end deepened instantly. A taco truck rolled through the intersection, its red brake lights bleeding across the wet pavement like diluted blood. "Shaq," Marcus finally spoke slowly. "Why are you bringing him up?" That wasn't the reaction of someone hearing an ordinary name. Shaq noticed immediately. "You know something." Marcus sighed softly through the phone. "I know Martin handled a few situations I never liked, such as..." This time Marcus stayed quiet longer. Farther down the street, another train horn echoed through the snowstorm. A young couple hurried across the sidewalk, laughing while leaning into the wind. Normal life continued around Shaq in a way that suddenly felt cruel. Finally, Marcus asked, "Where are you? Chicago with her?" Shaq closed his eyes briefly. So Marcus really did know. "You knew Caroline?" "Not personally." Marcus paused carefully, "But I saw the file." A cold weight moved through Shaq's chest. "What file?" Martin kept a separate folder. Marcus hesitated. He called them high-risk personal exposure cases. Shaq tightened his grip on the phone until his knuckles turned white. "Keep talking." "I only saw it once around 2010. Marcus sighed heavily. There were a few women's names, addresses, notes about media exposure, scandals, endorsement risks. I remember Caroline because Martin said something that bothered me at the time. He stopped talking. Shaq barely felt the cold anymore. "What did he say?" Marcus answered quietly, "If she stays quiet for 2 years, this disappears forever." Snow continued falling. But inside Shaq's head, no traffic, no wind, no city noise, just that sentence, disappears forever. 16 years, an entire life, a daughter, a woman living in fear, reduced to something that could simply disappear. Slowly, Shaq sat down on the cold bus stop bench while snow settled across his shoulders beneath the streetlights. Marcus. Yeah. Do you still have anything connected to Martin? Marcus paused again. I think I might. Shaq immediately looked up. What does that mean? I retired in 2018, Marcus said slowly. Before leaving, I backed up a lot of internal emails because I never trusted Martin. Some of the things he said always felt wrong. I just never had proof. And now? Marcus exhaled softly. Now I think you just found it. A hard gust of wind shook the advertisement panel beside the bus stop. Shaq lowered his eyes toward his hands. The same hands that lifted championship trophies, signed multi-million-dollar contracts, appeared on television in front of millions of people, and still failed to protect one small family in Chicago. That hurt more than anything else. Marcus finally asked, What are you going to do? Shaq looked back up toward apartment 3C one more time. The yellow light was still there. I don't know yet. Don't make this public too fast. You think I want them living in fear any longer? Marcus didn't answer, because both men understood the real issue wasn't in publicity anymore. It was trust. After the call ended at 8:31 p.m., Shaq remained sitting at the snow-covered bus stop for nearly 5 more minutes. An elderly woman pulling a grocery cart walked past and recognized him immediately, but she didn't ask for a photo. She simply smiled and said, Cold night to be thinking that hard, baby. A small laugh escaped Shaq for the first time all evening. Yeah, he answered quietly. Real cold. The woman nodded like she understood more than he expected, then continued down the snowy street, pushing her cart into the darkness. Sometimes strangers notice your sadness more clearly than friends do. Slowly, Shaq stood up. At that exact moment, his phone vibrated. A new email from Marcus Reed, subject Kessler Files. Shaq opened it immediately. Inside were 4 old PDF files, internal memos, call records, emails, meeting schedules, and one document dated February 14, 2010. The first sentence alone made his blood run cold. Recommendation: discourage further contact between Caroline Mercer and client until sponsorship negotiations are complete. Client, not a human being, not a woman, not a family, just a risk to manage. And standing there beneath the falling Chicago snow, with the glow of his phone lighting his face, Shaq finally understood the worst part. Martin Kessler hadn't acted alone. He had been doing this for years. Snow continued falling heavily across Chicago when Shaq returned to apartment 3C at 8:47 p.m. He didn't call first, didn't text, didn't want Caroline thinking he was arriving with lawyers and legal threats. After everything Marcus Reed had just sent him, the last thing Shaq wanted was to turn that small apartment into another battlefield between media people and corporate damage control. He only wanted the truth. The hallway floor creaked beneath his footsteps as he approached the apartment again. Warm yellow light still glowed beneath the door, but this time there was no piano music, no laughter, just the fragile silence of a family suddenly dragged backward into a past they had spent years trying to survive. Shaq knocked twice. A few seconds later, Caroline opened the door. The moment she saw him standing there again so soon, surprise flashed across her face immediately. Shaquille? I need to talk. She studied him carefully for several seconds before slowly stepping aside. Inside the apartment, Ellie sat cross-legged on the living room floor beside a small coffee table covered with dozens of sketches. A pencil rested behind one ear, while charcoal stains darkened her fingertips. The second she saw Shaq walk inside, she stood up automatically. Then the apartment fell silent again. Shaq removed his hoodie, brushed snow from his shoulders, and placed his phone carefully on the table. A man named Marcus Reed just sent me something. Caroline's face immediately lost color. Ellie looked back and forth between them like she was trying to read the missing parts of a story nobody wanted to say out loud. Shaq opened the email and handed the phone toward Caroline. She barely made it 10 seconds into reading, before sitting down heavily on the couch. Both hands began trembling. Oh my God! Ellie stepped closer. What is it? Caroline couldn't answer. Shaq looked toward the young woman and finally said quietly, Someone intentionally kept your mother away from me. Ellie froze. What does that mean? Shaq swallowed slowly. Martin Kessler knew about both of you long before you were born. Nobody spoke. Outside the windows, wind slammed snow against the old apartment building hard enough to rattle the glass. A snowplow rolled past Archer Avenue, yellow lights sweeping briefly through the apartment before disappearing. Ellie finally let out a quiet laugh, but it wasn't a happy sound. So Mum was telling the truth, she whispered almost to herself. Caroline covered her mouth with one hand. Shaq continued carefully. He treated this like a media problem. There are emails, internal memos, Phone records. Ellie stared at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since meeting him, she asked something completely different. You really didn't know I existed? That question almost knocked the breath out of Shaq's chest. He looked at the young woman standing beneath the warm apartment light. Her eyes weren't cold anymore, just tired. Tired from spending years wondering whether she had ever truly been wanted. Slowly, Shaq shook his head. If I had known, he paused. I would never have let this happen. Ellie stayed silent. Then unexpectedly, she walked toward a small shelf beside the window and pulled down an old cardboard box with worn corners. Mom said I shouldn't show you this, she admitted softly, but maybe now you should see it. She placed the box on the coffee table. Inside were dozens of small things, magazine clippings, old game tickets, screenshots from interviews, a faded NBA wristband, and stacks of sketches. Shaq picked one up carefully. It showed him asleep on an airplane. Another showed him laughing during an interview. Another captured him handing out food during a charity event. None of them looked like fan art. They looked like memories. Ellie stood beside the table with her arms crossed tightly, almost embarrassed that he was seeing this part of her. I started drawing you when I was 13, she admitted quietly. At first, I just wanted to see if I looked like you. Shaq felt his throat tighten. And then, Ellie shrugged slightly. Then I realized I just wanted to know what kind of person you really were. Silence drifted slowly across the apartment again. Caroline sat on the couch watching both of them with exhausted red eyes. After spending 16 years trying to keep life stable and quiet, the truth was finally stepping into the room on its own. Then Shaq picked up the final sketch and immediately froze. The drawing showed a giant man standing outside an apartment building in the snow, staring up toward a third-floor window. Warm yellow light touched his face, while behind the curtains, the shadow of a young girl quietly watched him from inside. In the bottom corner, a handwritten sentence read, "Maybe some people leave because nobody ever told them how to stay." Shaq read it twice. Then, very slowly, he lowered himself onto the couch, like his legs had suddenly become too heavy to carry him anymore. Ellie studied his reaction carefully before asking, "Are you mad that I drew you?" Shaq shook his head immediately. No, he looked around the apartment once more, at the sketches, at Caroline, at the daughter who had grown up without him. Then quietly, he said the most honest thing he had spoken all night. "I think I'm more angry at myself." The apartment fell silent again, but this time, it didn't feel cold anymore. By the next morning, Chicago had disappeared beneath nearly 8 inches of snow. Cars parked along Archer Avenue looked like silent white shapes beneath the pale gray sky, while traffic reports played through convenience store radios, warning drivers about black ice across the south side. But inside apartment 3C, nobody turned on the television. Caroline stood near the kitchen counter making coffee at 8:11 a.m. when her phone started vibrating again. Martin Kessler. The entire apartment immediately tensed. Ellie sat at the dining table, wearing an oversized gray hoodie, her sketchbook open in front of her. She looked up the second she noticed her mother's expression change. Across the room, Shaq sat near the window holding a half-finished cup of coffee when his eyes moved toward the phone. Martin was calling again. Third time since last night. Caroline instinctively reached to silence it. But Shaq spoke first. "Let me." She stared at him for several seconds. "Shaquille, trust me." Silence stretched between them for 3 slow breaths. Then finally, Caroline handed him the phone. Shaq turned on speaker mode. The voice on the other end spoke almost immediately. "Caroline, listen to me carefully. This situation needs to be handled before." He stopped abruptly because he heard Shaq's voice. "Good morning, Martin." Nobody inside the apartment moved. Outside the windows, snow continued sweeping across the old neighborhood while the sound of snowplows echoed faintly down the street. Martin finally answered more carefully. "Shaq, I can explain. You can start by explaining why you spent 16 years keeping them afraid." Silence. Then Martin sighed like he was somehow the one trapped in an unfair situation. Nobody threatened anybody. Ellie let out a cold laugh immediately. Martin continued faster now. "I was protecting your career. Everything back then was chaos. Press scandals, sponsorship deals, divorce lawyers. So you decided to erase them from my life?" "Shaq, be realistic." Martin's frustration started leaking into his voice. "You were one of the most recognizable athletes in America. Another family scandal could cost tens of millions of dollars." Shaq looked toward Ellie. The young woman sat frozen at the table, fingers gripping a pencil so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Another family scandal. That was how Martin described her. Not a daughter, not a child, not a human being, a problem. Something cold moved through Shaq's chest. You know the worst part, Martin? Silence on the other end. I trusted you, Martin answered immediately. And you were right to trust me. I helped build your image for over a decade. Shaq laughed quietly. Not angry, not amused, just disappointed. No, he said softly. You helped make me more famous. The apartment fell silent again. Martin's voice sharpened slightly. Shaq, listen carefully. If this story gets out emotionally, the media will tear everybody apart, including that girl. That girl. Ellie slowly lowered her eyes. Caroline turned away completely, too angry to even look at the phone anymore. But Shaq stayed perfectly calm, and somehow that silence scared Martin more than yelling ever could, because for the first time in years, he wasn't controlling the conversation anymore. Finally, Shaq spoke again. You're never calling her that again? Shaq, no. His voice dropped lower now. Her name is Ellie. Martin stopped talking completely. Shaq stood up from the couch and walked toward the apartment window. Snow continued covering Archer Avenue while the red neon pharmacy sign across the street flickered through the storm. You know the funny thing? Shaq asked quietly. Last night I sat at that bus stop outside for almost 20 minutes. Nobody interrupted him. An old woman recognized me. But she didn't ask for a photo, didn't ask for an autograph. She just looked at me and said, "Cold night to be thinking that hard, baby." Shaq stared down at the snow-covered street. A stranger treated me more like a human being than you treated my family. That sentence broke something. Martin didn't argue anymore, because he knew he had lost. Not legally. Not publicly. Humanly. Several seconds later, Martin spoke one final time, much quieter now. I really thought I was doing the right thing. Shaq closed his eyes briefly, and for the first time since the call began, the anger inside him disappeared completely. Only sadness remained. That's the scariest part. Then he ended the call. Silence settled over the apartment again. Ellie stared down at her sketchbook for a long moment before quietly asking, "He's going to lose his job, isn't he?" Shaq leaned lightly against the window frame. Probably. Do you want that to happen? Shaq thought about it for several seconds, then slowly shook his head. I want him to understand what he did. Ellie looked at him carefully, and for the first time since they met, she smiled. Very small, but real. 4 months later, winter finally loosened its grip on Chicago. The snow slowly disappeared from Archer Avenue, leaving behind dirty streams of melted ice along the curbs, while pale grass pushed back through cracks in the sidewalks. Small neighborhood stores reopened their front doors to the early spring air, and soft jazz music drifted from the cafe at the end of the block almost every morning alongside the smell of toasted bread and coffee. Chicago looked the same, but the people inside it had changed. At 7:40 on a Saturday morning, Shaq stepped out of a black SUV parked in front of Belford Drugs, carrying 2 hot chocolates and a large paper bag from Carter & Reed Art Supplies. He wore a grey hoodie, black joggers, and a knit beanie pulled low over his forehead, looking more like an unusually tall neighborhood guy than an NBA legend, at least, until he stood up straight. A teenage boy riding past on a bicycle slammed his brakes immediately. Yo, that's Shaq! Shaq raised one finger to his lips with a grin. The boy's eyes widened in panic before he nodded aggressively and pedaled away like he had just been trusted with classified information. Life is kind in strange little ways sometimes. Shaq walked into the apartment building and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The elevator was still broken. The same out-of-service sign still hung crooked beside the doors, like nobody in management had cared enough to remove it. But this time, when he stood outside apartment 3C, he didn't hesitate anymore. The door opened almost immediately. Ellie stood there with messy, up curls and a charcoal smudge across her left cheek. She wore an oversized Columbia College Chicago hoodie, nearly hanging to her knees, and the second she saw him, she grabbed one of the hot chocolates out of his hands. Finally, she muttered. I was starving. Shaq laughed softly. Good morning to you too. Ellie turned and walked back into the apartment. Mom, giant delivery is here. Carolyn's voice immediately echoed from the kitchen. Ellie? What? He's literally 7 feet tall. Shaq shook his head, smiling quietly as he stepped inside. The apartment still looked mostly the same, but not entirely. The picture frames were no longer turned face down. Several new sketches of Ellie's now hung framed along the walls, and sitting beside the window was a new photograph. Shaq and Ellie standing awkwardly together outside her art school after a portfolio review the month before. Both of them smiling slightly, both of them trying. What smells so good? Shaq asked while removing his coat. Breakfast tacos, Caroline answered from the kitchen. Ellie said you like Mexican food more than pancakes. Shaq looked toward Ellie, She shrugged casually like it wasn't important. I did research. Something warm moved quietly through his chest. Not dramatic, not loud. Just the feeling of finally existing inside someone else's small details. After breakfast, Ellie led Shaq into the art room near the back of the apartment. The room had changed a lot in 4 months. More sketches covered the walls now. Some showed Chicago after winter. Some were quiet portraits of Caroline cooking in the kitchen. And near the far window stood a large, unfinished painting that made Shaq stop walking immediately. It showed a giant man bending down to step through an apartment doorway far too small for him. But this time, the door was completely open. Ellie stood beside the canvas with her arms crossed awkwardly. I still haven't figured out a title. Shaq stared at the painting for a long moment before quietly asking, "What do you want to call it?" Ellie thought for several seconds, then answered softly, "Maybe." Stayed, not arrived, not returned. Stayed. Shaq felt his throat tighten again, because he understood exactly what she meant. Not everybody who shows up stays. And not everybody who stays is truly present. But he was trying, every single day. That afternoon, the three of them walked together to the cafe at the end of the block, while cold spring wind drifted through Archer Avenue. Some people recognized Shaq. A few asked for pictures. But for the first time in years, he no longer felt like he was balancing between two separate lives. Ellie walked on his left. Caroline walked on his right. And for the first time in a very long time, that made him feel complete. Martin Kessler eventually lost almost all of his major clients after a quiet internal investigation that lasted several months. There was no giant public scandal, no dramatic arrest, no screaming headlines. Just one company after another quietly deciding never to call him back again. His reputation disappeared the same way he once tried to make other people disappear. Quietly. 1 week earlier, Martin had sent Shaq a short email. No excuses, no lawyers, no PR strategy. Just one sentence. "I forgot people were human before they became problems." Shaq never replied, but he kept the email anyway. Because real regret doesn't always need an audience. That evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the old South Side buildings, Shaq stood alone on the small apartment balcony, watching traffic crawl through Archer Avenue below. Behind him, Ellie burst into laughter because Caroline had burned tortillas for the second time that week. Such a normal sound. But Shaq closed his eyes for a few seconds, just to listen to it a little longer. Because for years, he had everything in the world except that. And now, for the first time in a very long time, Shaquille O'Neal no longer felt like an NBA legend standing in front of millions of people. He simply felt like a father, finally learning how to stay. Some people believe the most painful thing in life is being abandoned. But sometimes, what hurts even more is realizing you spent years living inside an incomplete story without ever knowing what had been stolen from it. For most of his life, Shaquille O'Neal had everything the world tells a man should dream about. Money, fame, championships, multi-million-dollar contracts, crowds screaming his name every night. But nobody ever told him that sometimes, a tiny apartment on the south side of Chicago, filled with the smell of cinnamon and old piano music, could hurt your heart more than an entire silent arena. Because in the end, people rarely remember what you owned. They remember where you were present, and where you weren't when someone needed you most. Ellie didn't grow up with a famous father. Caroline didn't have an easy life, and Shaq couldn't erase 16 lost years with a few apologies and good intentions. Some pieces of time can never be bought back. But healing doesn't always begin with changing the past. Sometimes it begins with finally standing still long enough to face it honestly. Martin Kessler spent years treating people like problems that needed to be managed. And in the end, the thing that destroyed him wasn't scandal, lawsuits, or public humiliation. It was forgetting that every problem was a real human being trying to survive their own pain. That is the dangerous part. Not fame, not money, not power. But the moment we start seeing other people as obstacles that can be removed to make our own lives easier, thankfully, life sometimes offers second chances. Not perfect ones, not cinematic ones, not easy ones, just enough for a father to learn how to stay, for a mother to stop living in fear, and for a young woman to finally stop imagining her father through sketches and drawings. Because now, he was truly standing beside her. And sometimes, for a heart that waited far too long,